Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Lara Vanut, and I work as marketing coordinator at Codit. Welcome to this webinar about landing zones in Azure, building a secure and compliant foundation for cloud deployments. This webinar is hosted by our infrastructure architect, Jan Witvrouwen, and you will hear from him about the benefits of implementing landing zones for Microsoft Azure, the features, components, and best practices for designing, implementing, and running them. During the webinar, feel free to send your questions through in the Q&A, and we will answer them by the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I give the floor to Jan Witvrouwen.
Thank you, Lara. So today we'll go through a small introduction. We'll see some customer stories, talk about why landing zones are important, what functionalities they provide, and how to get started in Azure. And of course, as Lara said, we'll end with the Q&A, but don't hesitate to chat your questions during the presentation. And if I see them, I will answer them along the way already, if possible. So the start of a cloud journey, cloud is increasingly important for organizations that want to stay competitive and embrace digital transformation, because they need to evolve to keep the needs of the customers and employees within reach. So it's needless to say that the cloud is here to stay. It is not something from a one-day event. It has been around for a while and it is here to stay. And for some workloads, it's the most easy and effective solution that is in place at the moment. Of course, a journey only becomes a journey once they're clear about the destination. Otherwise, it's just aimless wandering. So set your goal in Azure as well. Otherwise, you will never reach your goal and we'll always have a project that has not succeeded. So a goal is very important. So set the goal why you should move to the cloud. This can be in the beginning, the driver could be a single application, some renewal that is only available in the cloud, or a first POC that defines that you are ready to go to the cloud and that your company is ready to embrace the future of cloud. The ways to go to the cloud can be simply a lift and shift rehosting. It's moving to the cloud without any modification. It's not my favorite because it usually ends up without any benefits for a single application. The benefits on the lift and shift are most likely found on an organization level, but it will always end up in reduced performance and increased costs versus an on-premise solution. A better approach, in my opinion, is a modernization. It's adjusting your applications a little so that they run on a cloud native, that they can use cloud native services and technologies. And by that, you'll achieve some improved performance and you will have the scalability that the cloud offers. Whereas on-premise, you're stuck to your own infrastructure. And the most ideal is, of course, refactoring. It is really redefining how an application is built, whilst taking full advantage of the cloud native features, like there are microservice architecture or serverless computing. You will get the best performance that the cloud can offer and have the scalability, of course, that the modernization track already have. Now, once you have set your destination, you can start a journey. We do, however, see that this journey is not always that easy as it might be seen at the first or be pictured by Microsoft, because it is very easy to run some resources in Azure, but building an entire data center in Azure can, of course, bring some challenges with it. So one of the biggest challenges that we see is building the right foundations for future growth and changes. We don't know what the future brings, but we have to be clear and build for that future, whatever it brings to us. Another common challenge is, of course, having all the right competences in your own teams. The war on talent is big, even though the hype from Facebook and Google are over and they let off people, but still finding the right competences and keep them in-house, especially when you start a new adventure towards the cloud and are not that big yet, it can be difficult. The complexity of Azure towards billing and resource types can be a little daunting, and especially for the non-technical financial departments, they might have their doubts on a changing buying cycle, because your developer can now spend money without any other part of the company approving to it. And then security is on top of the mind of most companies, or should be at least, and securing the right things without spending too much money for the things that you're building is something that we see can be quite of a challenge. The choosing between control and flexibility, what that means is you want to keep real control over your development teams or your third party that is developing something or deploying something in your Azure. But on the other hand, you want to also give them the flexibility to do what they do best without interfering with the company set rules. And of course, where to start? Where do you start on this big journey without having all the details already in your hands? So you're kind of playing blind from the beginning. But we'll take you through how we see that is an ideal journey and how you can proceed. Now, let's translate these challenges to some real life customers. So first, customer is a technical wholesaler. They have a small IT team with now 2 on-premise data centers, but they want to keep ahead of the competition, and they set a goal to modernize some workloads as their web shop, CRM, and ERP towards the cloud. Being only a small team, they struggle with managing all the competences and securing the right things and assuring their financial department that they will not go over budget versus what they have now. At this point, they don't know how far they will grow in the future, but at least they know that they have the intention to grow as a number 1 player in the market and keep that position. So another example is a research center. They have many temporary research projects, and they want to provide a safe environment towards their researchers that they can run proof of concepts without needing all the technical knowledge necessary to build or set something up in Azure. They want it to be flexible and fast, so they can deploy new environments for a new research project in a matter of hours. And they want to quickly on and offboard those projects as well. Once it stops, they have to stop the costs that are involved with it. They want to provide a safe haven, but also costs cannot outrise what they have predicted. So the main challenges are security, having the right competences, because the research center has other priorities than having the Azure knowledge in-house, and of course growth. If all goes well, they will have a lot of temporary research projects, but maybe in the future it will scale down as well, and they want to be able to hand it flexible. And then the third one is a financial institution. They have all the product teams in-house, so they know very well what they want to achieve. And they have a focus on user security and user experience. As being a financial institution, it's on their top priority. And all their development is done by third parties. So their legacy environment, the focus is to bring those legacy environments towards a more modern approach and a flexible solution to handle the peaks in the year on a better scale. So we have now seen 3 very different companies, and just as when you're building something like a house, a stadium, or a bridge, although they are very different, the approach is always the same. Everything starts with very good foundations, and all the three foundations have a big common thing, and it's all steel and concrete. And the same is true for the cloud. Although we are building for a somewhat smaller company with only 2 IT people and being a wholesaler towards the research company that has a lot more projects in Azure, everything comes down to building the right foundations so that your teams can go from there. And this is what we call a landing zone. So the landing zone is really the foundation. And let's see what other purposes they support. It's so the landing zone that is your foundation in building in Azure. It will give you a start to finish plan to building that foundations, because it is not something that no other company has done. So there are a lot of best practices available where you can start from. By having that best practices in place, you can enable the safe adoption of those new technologies that come with the cloud at your own pace. You know that your foundations are okay, and on them you can build by the pace of your teams or the pace of your company. With those consistent and repeatable environments design that the landing zone bring, you can scale out at any time in a manageable way. Because it is all provided by code, you can just launch up a new environment knowing that it is the same as the previous one. While still being best practices, there is always room for customization that meets your business requirements. We cannot force your company, or you will not force your company into something that you think is not suitable 100% for your own use. So you want to be able to get those business requirements in place. And last but not least, the landing zone provides a central point of view to view at your security and compliance across all deployments. So the balance between control and flexibility, you can look to all your deployments from that single pane glass so that you know what everybody is doing without interfering with all their deployments. So if you now that translate into a more graphic way, the landing zone, the platform is really those fundaments where you build your application landing zones on top. And those application landing zones can host your workload or your applications. By using this approach, you can hand over those application landing zones towards an internal, external owner that can take full ownership of what is deployed and the costs going with it without losing those guidelines you set from a central point of view. So you really build up on the foundations provided in that landing zone where you build your applications on top. These workloads can then be grouped at a functional level or an owner level. This is what the customization for your own needs is, of course, all about. Now that we know what is or what the landing zone is providing or should be providing, let's have a look what is included. So when setting up a landing zone, these topics are all included and ticked off as a centralized guardrail set towards all your application landing zone and your workloads. So the standardization and resource consistency helps ensure that the resources deployed are consistent across your entire organization. This reduces complexity because all resources are deployed in the same way. So whether team A or B is deploying resources, you know that they all will be named in the same way and that they all have the same parameters around and that you all foresee the same setup. The identity and access management helps you to ensure that only the right people can access all the resources at the right time. The last thing that we want is that the wrong people, let's say the competitor, can access your data and can run away with your key assets, or that you come prey towards a cyber attack, of course. The security and compliance is seamless integrated into that, getting your complete environment secure and compliant with whatever measurements you need to comply to are of course important and on top of everybody's mind. The monitoring and maintenance part, you can set it up, but nothing keeps running on its own, not even Azure. Although Microsoft is taking care for a lot of services for you, you still need to monitoring that your application and environment runs as required. The networking part is included. Although some resources can run just plain on the internet, most companies choose to integrate the cloud with their existing networking environment. So the landing zone also takes care of that part. The cost management makes and FinOps enables teams to monitor and manage their Azure costs. And it also helps to optimize the usage and the costs that are involved. Once you're growing, you only need, of course, to pay for what you need and not for idling resources. A landing zone also includes some deployment acceleration functionality, because everything should be deployed by code. Teams that come and deploy application workloads on it can benefit from those well-architected environments to run and copy into their own environment. Now, how can you get started? We already discussed that you need to define a strategy, because otherwise you will never succeed in what you're doing, or you will always succeed depending how you look at it. And depending from the point of view, you will be successful or either always fail. But we still believe that you need a decent strategy, why and how you should move to the cloud. Once you have that strategy, you can start with the plan phase. And in the plan phase, you will start with doing an assessment workshop so that you can document what future deployments should be using and should comply to. So these are simple instructions towards teams so that they know how to behave in your environment. After that workshop, it is time to pour those decisions into concrete and really start pouring out your foundations. So you set up the Azure DevOps so you can start deploying, and you will deploy the landing zone with, of course, the results of the workshops included. It would be a pity that you just deploy a pre-configured landing zone that you can download from the Microsoft pages without having the results of your own work included. While deploying the landing zone, you of course also start with the governance part. So you implement the designs that you have set up in the governance so that everybody needs to comply to what you have decided. You start with the kickoff of the FinOps, because from the start on, it is important to get the finance teams on board so that they are at ease on how the new way of working is, because you will be no longer making a budget, spending it once for every 3 or 5 years, investing in hardware and putting it in your basement and having a real clean idea what that environment will cost over the next 3 or 5 years, but you will evolve towards an hourly change in spends depending on your workload or depending on what your teams are deploying or doing. Meanwhile, you also set up your security that you have decided in the workshops, because once you start deploying the first workloads, you of course want that they are deployed in a secure way and not exposed to the internet from the beginning. And you start also monitoring that security posture. In your setup of a landing zone, everything can look secure, but once you start deploying the first workloads, this can of course change very rapidly. So you want to keep an eye on what teams are deploying. Even though they are deploying within your guidelines, they still can, how should I say it, color outside of the lines and have some kind of security breaches in place. And at that point, you also start the managed part. You start the monitoring, maintenance, and life cycle of everything that you deployed. And of course, also the resource access management to set up who can access what resources at what moment. At this point, the foundations are poured and set, and then it is time to get the teams working and start the adopt phase, where you hand out the application landing zones where there are foundation services included. So it is not only the pure foundation that you provide, but also the plumbing for parts of the deployments that will be done in there. Let's say, for instance, the access management is provided by your foundation, but also the networking is foreseen so that not each team that is deploying applications onto the landing zone have to worry on how they can communicate with the on-premise, for instance. Also, an important part that we see is that you provide at that point technical support towards the application teams, because the team that has done the landing zone deployment has already built up some knowledge on how, on the one hand, Azure works, and on the other hand, how your governance is set and how the guidelines are set for your own environment. So you can hand over that information towards the teams. Now we can of course help you with that. What we think is important in the landing zone as a service by Codit is the build everything as code approach that is focused on the needs, because we start from a user perspective. We are developers our own, and we build everything by code, and we believe that is a major must, because you can automate everything from platform updates with 2 continuous improvements with a track and trace from your code and from a DevOps perspective. And the landing zone that we have built is an open solution, and it is built on Microsoft best practices for cloud adoption. And I see a question coming in, why the everything as a code approach is so important. Well, we believe that it's important because you can apply versioning, testing, and automation, whereas a click approach or partly code approach cannot do this. By using GitHub or DevOps to deploy the landing zone and to make changes, you always have a clear track that can be followed. So you have the speed and the agility of an infrastructure as code. So you can quickly change stuff and exactly making sure that you can stay upfront what will be changing and follow what has changed throughout the past. So for us, it is a really important part of it. So we said that getting started, the first step was getting in your strategy. The second step was defining what you exactly need with the workshop. So a workshop, the goal is to really define the governance that you need. not only setting what the world thinks you need in a landing zone, but translating it towards your needs. So in that workshop, you really should cover some fundamental topics as security, networking, and the full governance on naming and tagging, how to organize everything, who is responsible for what, your way of operating, what team is responsible for what part of your landing zone, or where does the boundary between application and foundation start. Our approach in that is we first explain each topic to each and everyone in the workshop, because not everyone is, of course, a master in Azure. So we try to explain everything that we talk about, hand over the best practices and some considerations towards that topic. So for instance, if we're talking about networking, we first explain what VNetting and subnetting is about, how you can communicate to your on-premise by using an express route or a VPN side to side. So those things are first explained so that you know what you're deciding on. And then we have a brainstorm on the topic to get to a final blueprint for that single topic. Once then all the topics are gone through, the result is an extended governance design, which you can use to hand over first to build your own application, to build first your landing zone, but also to provide as a documentation towards the teams that will be deploying on that landing zone. Because they also need, of course, it is one thing to set up a real nice governance and defining what should and should not be done in your environment, but having the right documentation for it and being able to hand it to the teams that will be deploying on it will make a vast amount of time that comes free for your deployment, instead of finding out how you should deploy and talking to all the teams that were available in or were present in that workshop. And after that workshop, it is of course time to deploy the landing zone and then kick into action when deploying the applications themselves after you have deployed the foundation in there. So that really sums up how we see that the best approach is towards getting started with Azure and why landing zones are important. So if there are any questions, we'll answer them directly.
Yes, Jan, I saw that there is one question in the Q&A. What's the difference between platform landing zones and app landing zones? And are they also different in implementation?
The main difference, a platform landing zone is the foundation that we talked about. So it is really setting up all the needs where your teams can deploy on, and an application landing zone is the part that you hand over towards another team that can start deploying their applications in there. So the real difference is that the platform landing zone is really that foundation, and the application landing zone is a boundaried area where teams have ownership in and can deploy their applications in.
Perfect. Thank you, Jan. If there are any further questions, we'd still love to hear from you all. If there are no further questions, then we will conclude this webinar here, but feel free to reach out to us in the future if you would like more information about this topic. So that's this webinar for today. Thank you all for attending, and I wish you all a very pleasant day.